Today I'm going to tell you the story of Ethan McKenzie, a Colorado rancher whose horse Thunder refused to cross a familiar creek. Ethan and his neighbor Rebecca discovered that Thunder's instincts were warning them about 14 bodies buried beneath Willow Creek for over a decade. But the truth was more shocking than they ever imagined. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening to this story. When Thunder refused to cross the Colorado Territory, sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Ethan McKenzie guided his stallion Thunder toward Willow Creek. The summer of 1887 had been particularly dry, and the creek that separated his ranch from the neighboring Hartwell property had dwindled to barely 3 feet across. Ethan had been working this land for 8 years now, ever since he'd bought it from the previous owner, a gruff German immigrant named Klaus Brenner, who'd seemed eager to leave Colorado behind. Thunder, a magnificent black mustang, distinctive white markings on his chest, had been Ethan's faithful companion for the past 6 years. The horse possessed an uncanny ability to sense danger that had saved Ethan's life more times than he cared. During last winter's blizzard, Thunder had refused to cross what appeared to be solid snow, only for Ethan to discover a hidden ravine beneath. The previous spring, the stallion had shied away from a seemingly peaceful meadow that later revealed a rattle's den. "Come on, boy," adjusting his worn leather, the glaring. "We've crossed this creek hundreds of times." But Thunder planted his hooves firmly in the dusty earth and refused to. The horse's ears flicked nervously, and his nostrils flared. He snorted and stepped backward, away from the water's edge. Ethan frowned, studying the creek that looked exactly as it had every other day. Shallow, clear water flowing gently over smooth stone, a familiar old cottonwood tree casting into you. Ethan dismounted and walked to the water's edge, his boots crunching on the dried grass. The creek bed appeared normal, the water clean, inviting. He knelt and cupped some in his hands, tasting. Nothing unusual. Thunder whinnied anxiously, pawing the ground with increasing agitation. His behavior reminded Ethan of the stories his late father used to tell about horses in the war, how they could sense approaching danger long before any human could detect it. Thunder had never been wrong about danger. "All right, boy, I hear you," Ethan said, remounting his horse. "We'll find another way across." They rode north along the creek for nearly 2 miles before finding a crossing point where Thunder seemed comfortable wading through. Ethan made a mental note to investigate the original spot later, but for now he had cattle to check and fences to repair before the day grew any hotter. The afternoon progressed normally until Ethan encountered his neighbor, Rebecca Hartwell, near the property line. The 35-year-old widow had inherited the adjacent ranch from her late husband 3 years ago and had been struggling to keep it operational with limited help and even more limited funds. "Ethan!" Rebecca called out, riding her chestnut mare toward him. Her usually pristine appearance showed signs of a hard day's work, dust, her split riding skirt, and sweat beading on her forehead beneath her wide-brimmed hat. "I was hoping I'd see you today. I've been having the strangest problem." "What kind of problem?" Ethan asked, noting the worry line. Despite the hardship of frontier life, she maintained a dignified bearing, spoke to Eastern. "It's my horses," pushing a strand of auburn hair back. "For the past 4 days, they've refused to drink from all 3 of them to stand at the water's edge and back away. I've been hauling water from the well, but I can't keep that up." Ethan felt a chill despite the oppressive. "Which part of the creek?" "The section that runs along our shared fence line," Rebecca replied, "right where that old cottonwood leans over the water." "Why? Have you noticed anything strange?" "Thunder wouldn't cross there this morning. First time in 6 years he's refused to cross Willow Creek." Rebecca's expression was troubled. "That's exactly where my horse is acting up." "Ethan, what do you think it means? Could there be something in the water? Poison from an old mine, perhaps?" "I don't know," he said, "but I think we need to take a closer. Horses don't spook without good reason, especially multiple horses." They agreed to meet the following morning to investigate. As Ethan rode home, Thunder seemed calmer, but every time they passed near the creek, the horse's ears would prick forward alertly, as if listening for something only he could hear. That evening, Ethan sat on his porch of coffee, watching the sun set behind the rocks. Cattle dog Rex, feet, occasionally lifting his head to stare toward the peaceful scene, did little to settle his growing unease. His thoughts drifted back to Klaus Brenner, the German immigrant who had sold him. The man had been eager to selling at a surprisingly low price for such good grazing land. Ethan remembered Brenner's parting words, spoken, "Thick care of this place, yeah?" The land, she holds many secrets, some better left buried, I think. At the time had dismissed the old man's words as the ramblings of someone worn down frontier. Now 8 years later, he wondered if there had been more truth in those words than he had realized. The sound of Rex stirring brought Ethan back to the present. The dog lifted his head, growled low in his throat, staring into the gathering darkness toward the... Ethan followed his gaze, saw nothing, the moonlight beginning to reflect off the waters. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked softly. Rex stood up, his hackles raised, and took a few tentative steps toward the creek before stopping and whining uncertainly. This was unusual behavior for the normally fearless dog who would chase off coyotes and mountain lions without hesitation. Ethan rose from his chair and walked to the edge of his porch. The night air carried an unusual scent, not unpleasant, but different. Earthy and metallic, like the smell that sometimes followed heavy rainstorms, though it hadn't rained in over 3 weeks. In the distance he could hear Thunder moving restlessly in the corral, occasionally snorting and stamping his hooves. The other horses seemed agitated too, their soft nickering carrying across the quiet ranch yard. Even the cattle in the far pasture appeared unsettled, lowing softly in the darkness. As he prepared for bed, Ethan found himself checking the loading of his Winchester for the first time in months. The Colorado Territory wasn't the kind of place where a man could afford to be careless, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. Tomorrow, he decided, he would listen very carefully to what Thunder and the other animals were trying to tell him. In this harsh land, a smart man learned to trust the instincts of creatures whose survival depended on sensing danger before it struck. What lies beneath the surface. Dawn broke gray and dusty across the Colorado Territory, with heavy clouds promising a rare summer thunderstorm before noon. Ethan arrived at the creek just as Rebecca rode up on her mare, Buttercup. Both riders dismounted near the old cottonwood tree that marked the spot where their horses had shown such peculiar behavior. "I brought some tools," Rebecca said, indicating the canvas tied to her. "A rope, a small spade, and my late husband's compass. Thomas used to prospect for gold in his spare time, though he never found much more than fool's gold and old horseshoes." Ethan nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. Let's start by examining the water more closely." They waded into the shallow creek, the cool water, a welcome relief from the already building heat. Thunder and Buttercup remained on the bank, ears alert but clearly uncomfortable. Both horses kept stepping back whenever their owners moved deeper into the water near the cottonwood tree. "Look at this," Ethan called out, crouching down about 4 feet from the bank. The water was crystal clear, but something beneath the creek caught his eye. "There's something here that doesn't belong." Rebecca joined him, her riding skirt hampering her movement in the water. Partially buried in the sandy bottom was what appeared to be a corner of metal, green with age and corrosion. It looked deliberately placed rather than something that had washed downstream naturally. "That's not natural," Rebecca agreed, her voice tight with concern. "Should we try to dig it up?" Ethan studied the object carefully. It was roughly rectangular and appeared to be made of tin or steel. The visible corner showed signs of extensive rust and wear, suggesting it had been buried for many years. "Let's see what else might be down here first," Ethan suggested, using his boot to gently probe the creek. Within minutes, they discovered 2 more metal objects buried in the sandy bottom, both following the same pattern of deliberate placement. The items were spaced roughly 10 feet apart, forming what appeared to be a straight line parallel to the creek bank. "Ethan," Rebecca's voice carried a note of fear she was trying to suppress, "this isn't random. Someone put these here on purpose." "I'm starting to think the same thing," he replied grimly. "But who and why?" Rebecca sat on a fallen log, considering their option. "My neighbor in town, Mrs. Patterson. Her brother works for the territorial marshal. Maybe we should start there. If they're what I'm starting to think they might be, there could be proper procedures to follow." "What exactly are you thinking might be?" Though he had a growing suspicion he already knew the answer. "Ethan, what if these aren't just random objects? What if they're—" Pause, unable to voice her darkest. "What if they mark where someone buried things they didn't want found?" As if to emphasize her point, Thunder suddenly reared up on his hind legs, whinnying loudly. Both humans turned to see what had startled him. At first, nothing seemed out of place, but then Ethan noticed the smell again. That same earthy, metallic odor from the night before, now stronger and more pronounced in the humid air. "Do you smell that?" he asked Rebecca. She wrinkled her nose and nodded slowly. "It's like old metal mixed with something else, something I can't place." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, despite the growing heat of the day. In his 8 years of ranching in Colorado, he had encountered his share of unpleasant discoveries: dead livestock, predator kills, even the occasional human tragedy. This smell reminded him of those experiences, but there was something different, something that spoke of much older sea. "Rebecca, I think we need to make a decision. Either we forget about this and find ways to keep our animals away from this section of the creek, or we commit to finding out what's down there." Rebecca stood up, straightening her shoulders with the same determination that had kept her ranch running despite overwhelming odds. "I can't just ignore this. My horses depend on this creek for water, and if there's something dangerous here, other animals could be affected too. Besides," she added with a grim smile, "I've never been one to run from trouble." Ethan admired her courage. Since Thomas's death, Rebecca had faced every challenge on her ranch with quiet determination, never asking for help unless absolutely necessary. Her willingness to pursue this mystery despite the obvious risks spoke to her character. "All right then," Ethan said, "but we do this carefully. We mark these locations, document what we find, and if we discover anything that looks remotely suspicious, we stop immediately and ride to town for the marshal." They spent the rest of the morning carefully marking the locations of each buried object with small rocks Rebecca had brought for the purpose. The pattern that emerged was deeply troubling. The objects appeared to be arranged in a deliberate grid pattern, as if they had been placed there as markers, rather than randomly buried. By the time they finished their survey, dark clouds had moved in overhead, and the first drops of rain began to fall. As they packed up their equipment, Ethan noticed that both horses seemed eager to leave the area, no longer just reluctant, but actively pulling away the creek. By the time they finished their survey, dark clouds had moved in overhead, and the first drops of rain began. As they packed up their equipment, Ethan noticed that both horses seemed eager to leave the area, no longer just reluctant, but actively pulling away. As they mounted their horses, Ethan took one last look. The water, which had always so peaceful, now appeared ominous under the darkening sky. The small rock markers they had placed, the story neither of them was ready to fully comprehend. "Ethan," Rebecca said quietly, "there's something I didn't mention earlier. Last night I found fresh tracks around my water well, boot prints that weren't mine or any of my ranch hands. They were recent, maybe 2 days old." Ethan pulled Thunder to a stop. "What kind of tracks?" "Heavy work boots, larger than mine. They circled the well twice and then headed toward the creek." Rebecca's voice carried worry she had been trying to. "I thought maybe it was just a drifter passing through, but now it seems like too much of a coincidence." Finished. "Rebecca, you shouldn't be alone on your ranch tonight. Why don't you stay at my place? I've got a spare room, and we can keep watch on both properties from there." Rebecca considered his offer. Pride had kept her independent since Thomas's death, but the events of the past 2 days had shaken her. "I appreciate that, Ethan. Maybe for tonight, until we figure out what we're dealing with." As they rode toward Ethan's ranch house, the rain began falling harder, turning the dusty trail into mud. Behind them, Willow Creek continued its flow, carrying whatever secrets lay beneath its surface. The horses seemed to relax as they moved away from the creek, but Ethan noticed they kept looking back, as if ensuring that whatever lurked beneath the water wasn't following them home. "Tomorrow," Rebecca said as they prepared to ride home, "we start digging. The buried truth emerges." The next morning arrived with an unusual stillness that seemed to blanket the entire Colorado territory. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the air clean but heavy with moisture. Ethan and Rebecca met at the creek just after sunrise, both carrying more sophisticated digging equipment borrowed from Ethan's tool shed. They had decided to start with the largest metal object located closest to the old cottonwood tree. "I sent word to town yesterday," Rebecca reported as they set up their equipment. "Mrs. Patterson's brother, Marshal Hayes, is riding out this afternoon. He said if we find anything significant, the territorial government has procedures for handling discovery." Ethan nodded, though he had a growing suspicion that whatever they found might require more than territorial procedures. Thunder and Buttercup safely tied to trees well away from the creek, both animals still showing obvious distress whenever they looked toward the water. The first object proved easier to excavate. The recent rain had softened the creek bed, and within 2 hours of careful digging, They had exposed what appeared to be a metal strongbox, heavily corroded but still intact. Ethan used a brush to clean away the mud and sediment, revealing traces of faded lettering on the... "Can you make out what it says?" Rebecca asked, leaning closer while maintaining her footing on the slippery creek bank. Ethan squinted at a partially legible text. "Looks like K. And there's a date, but I can't quite..." He paused, a chill running down his despite the warming morning sun. "Rebecca, that's the name of the man who sold me this ranch. Klaus Brenner." Rebecca's eyes widened. "The previous owner? But that was 8 years ago." 8 years exactly," Ethan said grimly. "And according to folks in town, he left Colorado Territory and never came back. They carefully lifted the strongbox from its resting place and carried it to dry ground. The metal container was locked, but the corrosion had weakened the mechanism enough that Ethan was able to force it open with his knife. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oiled canvas, they found an assortment of items that made their blood run cold. Personal documents in German, yellowed with age and water damage, but still partially readable. A collection of jewelry, rings, pocket watches, and necklace, tarnished black but clearly valuable. Most disturbing of all, a small leather journal filled with meticulous handwriting with German. "Ethan," Rebecca whispered, pointing to one of the document books, "look at the names on these papers." Ethan examined the documents more closely. They appeared to be identification papers and travel documents, but the names were unfamiliar. European names, German and Polish. The photographs showed faces of people he didn't recognize, men, women, and children of various, all with the hopeful expressions of those seeking a new life in America. Rebecca had opened the leather journal and was reading the English. Her face grew pale. "Ethan, this is some kind of people, names, dates, amounts of money. And look at this." She showed him a page dated 10 years before Ethan hit the ranch. The handwriting was precise, but revealed a growing desperation. "The Kowalski family arrived today. 7 in total, including 3 children. Promised them work in the silver mine, but the vein played out 2 years ago. They paid me their life savings, $80. What am I to do? If word gets out about the others, I'll hang for sure." Ethan felt sick to his stomach. "Rebecca, I think we need to stop digging and ride to town for the marshal right now." "There's more," Rebecca continued reading, her voice barely above a whisper. "Listen to this entry from a month later. Cannot sleep. The dreams haunt me, but what choice did I have? They would have starved anyway, and if they had reached town and started asking questions, buried them near the creek where the ground stays soft from the water. May God forgive my..." "What?" They sat in stunned silence for several minutes, the implications of their discovery settling over them, a suffocating shroud. Ethan thought about all the years he had worked this, never knowing what lay beneath the peaceful surface of Willow Creek. "How many people do you think are buried here?" Rebecca asked quietly. Ethan looked at the rock markers they had placed throughout their search area. "Based on what we found yesterday, at least 5 or 6 more containers like this one." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Marshal Hayes had arrived earlier than expected, accompanied by 2 men Ethan didn't recognize, one wearing a badge that identified him as a deputy, the other in the plain clothes of a territorial. "Mrs. Hartwell, I hope you don't mind, but I brought some additional help. When you mentioned finding buried objects, I thought it best to have proper law enforcement present from the beginning." Marshal Hayes, a man in his 40s with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had seen too much of frontier justice, surveyed the scene with professional interest. "I'm Marshal Hayes, and this is Deputy Morrison and Investigator Campbell from the territorial capital." Ethan and Rebecca exchanged glances. There was no turning back now. "Marshal," Ethan said carefully, "I think you'd better take a look at what we found in this strongbox. And you should know, we have reason to believe there are several more buried in this." Marshal Hayes examined the contents of Klaus Brenner's strongbox with growing concern. He spent particular attention on the journal, reading several entries before looking up at Ethan and Rebecca with a grim expression. "Folks, this has just become a territorial investment. I'm going to need you to step back while we call in some additional resources. We're going to need the territorial coroner, probably some federal marshals, and definitely some specialized digging equipment." As they watched Marshal Hayes and his men taken to the scene, Ethan put his arm around Rebecca's shoulder. Neither of them spoke, but both were thinking the same thing. Their quiet corner of the Colorado Territory was about to be changed forever by the secrets that had been hidden beneath Willow Creek for more than a decade. Justice comes to Willow Creek. 3 weeks later, Ethan stood on his porch watching the last of the territorial investigation team pack up their equipment. The discovery at Willow Creek had transformed his quiet ranch into the center of one of Colorado Territory's most shocking criminal investigations. Now, as autumn began to paint the aspens gold in the distant mountains, the truth of what had happened beneath the peaceful creek was finally becoming clear. Marshal Hayes approached, carrying a thick leather portfolio of documents. His face showed the strain of the past few weeks, but there was also a sense of resolution in his weathered feature. "Ethan, I wanted to give you and Mrs. Hartwell a final accounting before we close this investigation," he said, settling into one of the porch chairs. "We've been able to piece together most of the story from Klaus Brenner's journal and the evidence we recovered." Rebecca joined them, carrying 3. She had continued staying at Ethan's ranch throughout the investigation, partly for practical reasons, but mostly because neither of them wanted to face alone what they had discovered on their land. "How many?" Ethan asked quietly, though he wasn't sure he really wanted to know the answer. 14 people, Marshal Hayes solemn, all immigrants who arrived in this area between 1875 and 1879. According to Brenner's records, they were mostly German and Polish families who had been promised work in a silver mine that had already played out. Rebecca set down her coffee with trembling hands. 14 souls. Were there children among them? 4 children, the marshal. The youngest was only 6 years old. Brenner's journal suggests he initially tried to help them find other work, but as more groups arrived and his deception became harder to maintain, he made increasingly desperate choices. Ethan thought about Klaus Brenner, the nervous German immigrant who had sold him the ranch at such a surprisingly low price. He remembered the man's haunted eyes and his urgent desire to leave Colorado Territory behind. What about justice? Brenner's long gone. Is there anyone else who was involved? Marshal Hayes shook his. "As far as we can determine, Brenner acted alone. The journal entries suggest he was running an immigration swindle, taking life savings from desperate families in exchange for promises of work that didn't exist. When they arrived and discovered the truth, he apparently felt he had no choice but to silence them permanently. But why bury them by the creek?" Ethan wondered aloud. "The soil there stays soft year-round because of the water table," the marshal explained. "Easier to dig and less likely to be disturbed by farming or grazing." Brenner was a practical, even in his desperate. The 3 sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, watching the sun begin its descent toward the rocky. The landscape looked the same as it had a month ago, but everything different. The weight of knowledge had changed their relationship with the land itself. "There's something else, Marshal. The territorial government has decided to establish a proper burial ground. With your permission, they want to create a small cemetery near the creek to honor the victims. The few families we've been able to locate back east have requested that the remains be properly interred with Christian burial." Ethan nodded. "Of course. It's the least we can do for them." "What about our horses? Do you think they'll ever be comfortable around the creek again?" "Animals have long memories," Ethan replied, thinking of Thunder's persistent refusal to cross them. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe they were trying to ensure these people weren't forgotten." Over the following months, the story of Willow Creek spread throughout Colorado Territory and beyond. The discovery led to a broader investigation into immigration fraud in the period and helped bring some measure of closure to families who had lost track of relatives decades earlier. The burial service, held on a crisp October morning, was attended by more than 100 people, including relatives of some of the victims who traveled as far away as Chicago and New York. Ethan and Rebecca found themselves forever bonded by their shared experience. As winter approached, they often stood together at the new cemetery, marked by simple wooden crosses that bore the names of all 14 victims. The creek still flowed past it, clear and cold, but now it carried their stories with it instead of Thunder and the other horses gradually became more comfortable near the creek, though they remained respectful of the burial ground. Ethan liked to think they understood that their vigilance served its purpose. The buried secrets brought to light, and the forgotten dead had finally been given the dignity they deserved. On quiet evening, when the wind whispered through the cottonwood and the stars emerged over the vast Colorado sky, Ethan would sometimes catch the faint scent of that metallic, earthy smell that had first alerted them to the mist. But now, instead of bringing dread, it served as a reminder that the land itself had been keeping watch, waiting patiently for someone to listen to what it had been trying to say. The horses, it turned out, had been the first to hear its voice, and in refusing to cross Willow Creek, Thunder had started a chain of events that brought justice to 14 forgotten souls and piece of land that had carried their secret for far too. Some secrets, Ethan reflected, were meant to be discovered, and sometimes the most unlikely lawmen were the ones with 4 legs and the wisdom to trust their instinct when something wasn't right.